long after the last timber of the forgotten shack had collapsed into the earth. A traveler, shielding his eyes from the sun, found something glinting in the dirt. It wasn't gold. It was a silver hairpin, heavy and cool in his palm. Its head was engraved with wild poppies, their petals still clear against the tarnish of time. A beautiful thing. Far too beautiful for a place that held only the ghost of a story. He looked up at the one beam that still stood against the sky, where a name had been carved with a steady, determined hand. A name the wind had tried, and failed, to erase. What kind of woman, he wondered, would leave such a treasure in the ruins of her life? This is her story. In the Stillwater Creek Valley, the heat didn't just bake the ground. It pressed down on secrets, holding them in the cracked earth. The sun didn't set in a blaze of glory, but as a deep, purple bruise that spread across the sky. Where the mesquite trees clawed at the fading light like desperate fingers. The town itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something it both craved and feared. Cruelty here was never a sudden thing. It simmered. Like embers hidden under ash. Waiting for just the right wind to be coaxed into a flame. And that flame found Abigail Parsons in the summer she turned 17. Before that, Abigail had a laugh. It was a rare thing, like the sound of a spring thaw in a frozen land. A little too loud. A little too sudden for a place like this. You could hear it when she hauled buckets from the well, the hem of her apron smudged with dirt, the summer sun warm on her bare arms. Her father, who kept the general store, was a man with stooped shoulders and a Bible on his counter that had become more habit than faith. Her mother was long gone, and folks said Abigail had her mother's gaze. The kind that seemed to see things people wanted to keep buried. It wasn't meant as a kindness. That spring, the figures began to appear on the ridgeline. Silent horsemen against the horizon, like phantoms from an old tale. Reverend Miller called them God's reminder of the wilderness that still lived among them. Sheriff Cole just quietly cleaned his rifle, his eyes cold and hard. And Abigail. She watched them too, from the hill where the wild poppies grew, with more curiosity than fear. It was a late May morning when she saw him. Alone. He was kneeling by the creek, trying to hold his life in against the red gash on his forearm. He didn't look like the monsters from the sermons. Not wild, not a beast. Just a boy, trying not to die. She should have walked away. But she stepped forward, slowly. He looked up, startled but not panicked. They stared at each other across the shallow water, not a word between them. She hesitated. Then tore a strip of white lace from the cuff of her sleeve. A small, clean thing in a dirty world. She tossed it to him. He caught it, wrapped it tightly around the wound, and nodded once. A silent acknowledgement. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she turned and walked away. And that was the beginning of the end. Gossip in Stillwater Creek moved like a fever. Someone found that piece of white lace snagged on a barbed wire fence near the South Trail. And that was all the proof they needed. The silence in her small home became a wall of stone. Her father wouldn't look at her, his eyes vacant. 2 nights later, Sheriff Cole came. He brought 2 men with calloused hands and vacant eyes. They didn't call her name. They didn't give her time to scream. A heavy burlap sack fell over her world. The smell of dust and stale grain filled her lungs, and her feet found only air. She woke in a barn that reeked of old hay and a cold, settled malice. The sack was gone. The flickering light of a lantern played across Cole's face, calm as if he were performing a necessary chore. One of the other men was holding a length of metal in the embers. It glowed a wicked, orange promise. "This ain't about vengeance, girl," the sheriff's voice was flat, like packed earth. "This is about order. About marking what don't belong." The agony wasn't just on her skin. It was a brand on her very soul. A searing lie burned into her flesh. The word claimed. It was carved in a cruel script across the soft skin of her belly. When they were done, they cut the ropes, and left her there. Shaking and broken in the straw. She was left in the straw, a broken thing. By dawn, she crawled from the barn. Blood and shame clung to her dress. She walked barefoot through the town she once called home. Past the church, its steeple a silent, accusing finger. Past the store where her father's Bible once lay. No one looked at her. And that was worse than the hate. The absence. The sudden, suffocating silence. The air itself seemed to swallow her whole. An old woman, Widow Hemlock, found her by the creek. The woman said nothing. She just wrapped a tattered quilt around Abigail's shoulders and led her to the edge of town. To a forgotten shack. Leaning against the sky as if it had given up on standing straight. They don't own the sky, the old woman whispered, then left her. For weeks, Abigail did not leave the cabin. She ate the roots and bread the widow left by the door. Her wound festered. Then scarred. At night, her fingers would trace its shape in the dark. As if learning the edges of her own ruin. The town moved on. But sometimes, a rock would be thrown against her door in the dead of night. Once, a word was carved into the wood. She scrubbed it with a wet rag until her knuckles were raw, until the wood was smooth again. But the feeling stayed. Then, one morning, she saw the footprints. Small things at first. A displaced stone. A faint print in the dust, too narrow to be a settler's boot. She told herself it was the wind. A coyote. But then came the rabbit. It was laid gently on her doorstep. Skinned, cleaned. Still warm. Her heart hammered in her chest. She looked out toward the ridgeline. Nothing. Only the endless brush, and a whisper of wind through cedar. She took the offering inside. The next morning, a deer pelt. Folded neatly. Soft and supple. The day after that. A braid of white beads. Polished bone, the exact color of the lace she had torn from her sleeve by the creek. Her breath caught. Her hands trembled as she touched them. He had remembered. She looped the beads around her neck, tucking them beneath her dress. It was the first warmth she had felt in a year. And it did not come from a fire. He returned to her world not as a ghost, but as a man. One evening, as the light turned soft and forgiving, she saw him. He stood at the edge of her small field, just beyond the leaning fence post. Still as the land itself. Unmoving. Unafraid. She did not speak. Neither did he. He reached into a leather pouch, placed a bundle on the ground, then nodded once. And walked away. That night, she held the white beads he had given her. Not crying, but close to it. Not from pity. But from recognition. Someone had seen her, and had not looked away. A sound slipped from her lips one afternoon, while mending a tear in her dress. A hum. Low and unsteady at first. The first note of a song she thought was long dead. She began to plant wild herbs beneath her window. One morning, she woke to find her fence repaired. The wood mended, the posts straight. He had done it in the dark, a silent guardian tending to what the world had abandoned. She wanted to say, thank you. Instead, she left a small strip of rabbit fur, soft and white, draped over the new gate. A quiet answer. But towns like Stillwater Creek have eyes. The whispers returned, sharper this time. Sheriff Cole rode past her cabin, his gaze a heavy weight. The second time, he stopped. He didn't dismount. Just stared at her, his hands resting on his saddle horn. Word is, you have company. She did not answer. I don't care what you think he sees in you, his voice was low and gravelly. But this town doesn't like trouble. You bring him too close. You'll both burn. She met his stare, her own eyes clear and cold. I burned once already. He spat in the dirt, turned his horse, and rode away. The attack came 2 nights later. It began with a thud against the door. Then another, harder. The wood splintered. Sheriff Cole stood in the doorway, lantern held high, 2 men behind him. Thought I'd find you playing house, he sneered. Get out, she said, her voice steady, a fire poker gripped tight in her hand. One of the men lunged for her. She swung. The poker caught him hard on the shoulder. The second man grabbed her arm, but a shadow moved through the broken doorway. Silent. Swift. Tacoma. He hit the man like a falling oak, A storm of fury that was over in an instant. The lantern crashed, shattering, its oil spilling and licking up the dry wood of the wall. Flames erupted. Cole drew his pistol. But Tacoma was faster, knocking the sheriff's arm wide as the gun fired, the bullet tearing into the ceiling. The room filled with smoke and the crackle of fire. Through the chaos, Elizabeth stood over the fallen rifle. She raised it, pointing it with both hands. "Leave," she commanded, her voice ringing with the fire's own fury. They retreated into the night, wounded and enraged. When the smoke cleared, he helped her stamp out the last of the flames. The air smelled of ash and pine. She sank to the floor, her body trembling, the scar on her belly throbbing like a fresh wound. He knelt beside her. Slowly, gently, he reached a hand toward the tear in her dress. She flinched, but did not pull away. He looked at her, a quiet question in his eyes. She gave a single, almost imperceptible, nod. His fingers brushed the fabric aside, just enough to reveal the cruel, silvered script. Claimed. His gaze did not waver. He didn't speak. He simply placed his palm over it. Not pressing. Just covering it. His hand was warm. And for a moment, the word beneath it disappeared. He looked from the scar to her eyes, and in their shared silence, something was finally understood. Something was finally answered. He left before dawn, melting back into the trees as silently as he had arrived. The silence that followed the attack was not peace. It was pressure. A stillness that gathered in the air, heavy and waiting. Sheriff Cole did not return the next day, nor the next. His absence was a threat, a coiled thing. Abigail spent her days sharpening an old hatchet, mending what could be mended. Not because she planned to run. This small ruin was hers, reclaimed from shame with her own two hands. She would not give it up. But she would be ready. He returned on the third evening. His face was drawn, his eyes holding the weight of the coming storm. She opened the door before he reached it. And for the first time, he stepped inside. The space was small, but the silence was no longer awkward between them. It was a language of its own. She handed him a cup of water. His hand trembled, just enough to betray what his face did not. "They'll come back," she said softly. He nodded once. "They won't come to frighten me this time," she continued, her voice steady. "They'll come to finish it." Another nod. She looked at the small fire burning in the hearth. "You don't have to stay. This isn't your fight." He looked at her then, his gaze direct. "I stayed," he said. It was not an explanation. It was a fact. At dawn, the news came. Not by a rider, but by a sound. The chapel bell rang once. A single, iron note that rolled across the prairie like a verdict. The town had made its decision. A public reckoning. Before noon, Widow Hemlock appeared, a parcel clutched in her hands. "They will try to make it look like justice," the old woman said, her voice thin against the wind. "They will speak of sin and moral order, to hide the ugliness of what they truly want." Abigail looked toward the town, then back at the old woman. "They will speak to a crowd that has already chosen to be silent." "Perhaps," the widow said, pressing the parcel into Abigail's hands. "But silence doesn't last, once someone starts speaking the truth out loud." Inside the parcel were two things. A simple dress of undyed cotton. Clean. Whole. And a single silver hairpin, its head engraved with wild poppies. "It was my mother's," the widow explained. "She wore it when she stood in court to keep her land. She didn't win. But they remembered her face after." Abigail held the cool, heavy silver in her palm. She did not need to ask why it was given to her. She already knew. When the sun hung low and sharp in the sky, they came. The sheriff, the reverend, and a crowd of men, their faces set like stone. They waited at the edge of town, expecting her to be dragged out, a spectacle for their cold justice. But she walked to meet them. Her head was high. She wore the simple dress like armor, and the silver pin in her hair caught the dying light like a single, defiant star. Tacoma followed a few paces behind her. Unarmed. unhurried. The townsfolk parted as he passed, a wave of fear and uncertainty. He did not look at them. His eyes were only on her. The Reverend stepped forward, his voice rising to fill the silence. This woman was given a chance to return to decency. She squandered it, and invited darkness into our midst. Abigail looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "You didn't brand me to save me," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You branded me to silence me. Because you were afraid of a kindness you could not understand." The crowd shifted, a low murmur rippling through them. "You seduced a savage and flaunted his corruption." The Reverend snapped, his face turning red. Tacoma spoke then, his voice quiet but cutting through the air. "She gave me water when I was bleeding. If you call that corruption, then you are truly lost." Sheriff Cole raised a hand. "Enough of this. We'll let a judge decide her sentence." "What sentence?" Abigail asked, stepping forward. "There was no judge when you dragged me from my home. No trial when you burned my skin." "You were spared," Cole growled. "I was marked," she said, her voice rising so all could hear. "Marked so no one would ever want me. So I would rot in silence while you told yourselves stories about my sin. But I did not rot. I lived. And I remembered." The silence was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She reached for the buttons on her dress, her movements deliberate, and parted the fabric just enough to reveal the scar. "Faded. Silver. Still cruel. You branded me a thing. But I am still here," she said, her voice softer now, but heavier. "I took your word. And I lived past it." The sheriff's face twisted with fury. He strode toward her, his hand raised to strike. But a figure moved, quick as instinct. Tacoma stepped between them. The sheriff's blow never landed. He returned no blow. He drew no weapon. He simply stood there. A solid, unmovable presence. A promise of what would happen next. And in that moment, the sheriff's power vanished. He had expected a fight. He did not know how to face stillness. Behind them, someone in the crowd murmured, "Let them be." Widow Hemlock stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. "You told us the scar made her unworthy," she called out. "But I see a woman standing unbroken. You called her shame. I call her a miracle." The spell was broken. The sheriff lowered his hand. The Reverend stepped back into the shadows of the crowd. Abigail breathed. She turned to Tacoma, and for the first time in front of them all, she reached out and took his hand. They walked together, down the main street of Stillwater Creek. Past the chapel, past the store. No one stopped them. Not everyone watched. But enough did. Later that night, in her cabin, a single candle burned. The silver hairpin lay beside it. Her name, carved whole above the doorway, seemed to glow in the soft light. Outside, the stars shone like truths that could no longer be buried. She sat by the window and whispered to the wind. "They tried to burn the world away from me. But I stayed." And the wind, rattling softly through the cracked windowpane, seemed to whisper back, "We saw."